Out now. Hello, everybody. Welcome to On the Contrary for the NFL's playoff divisional round. 4 big games today, some big spreads, a lot of interesting angles to talk about ways you can get different in all the big tournaments you'll find industry-wide. I'm Chris Spags, joined as always by the top DFS player in the world, the namesake of this site, man you know is Osmo, that I call Alex Baker. How are you doing, Alex?
I'm doing well, man. It's fun doing these playoff slates. The sweat is a little bit intense, so being 2 days instead of one. But man, just following everything in real time, you can watch every game. It's a pretty good experience. What do you guys think?
Yeah, well, I know one guy is going to have some thoughts on it. A guy from Football Guys. I said the word guy way too many times in that sentence, but a man who's coming back here in our Tournament of Champions of On the Contrary, some of our best recurring guests from the year. Steve Buzzard. How are you doing, Steve?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back, guys. Really appreciate it. Had a lot of fun last time and glad to get a chance to run it back here one more time so I can make some hopefully better takes than even last time. Last time, everything gets better as the season goes on, right? So.
Of course, bigger sample size and just the law of averages says at some point we all have to be right when doing hours of this content every single week. But you know what, guys? We're happy to have Steve back. We're happy to have Alex with us again. And of course, we're happy to have you guys with us. But we're happiest when we are playing on a DFS site that doesn't have any rake. And that's what you are getting when you play on fantasydraft.com, the official sponsor of On the Contrary. So as many of our other shows throughout this NFL season, go there right now and use the promo code OSMO to get yourself 7 days rake free. Hooters main event has still been going on over there, the largest DFS contest that is rake free you will find industry-wide. So go check them out. Save yourself some bankroll. Alex, we only have a few more weeks left of this, but how many wings could you have made in the wild card round or bought in the wild card round with the money you saved on fantasy draft?
Yeah, I mean, happiest is not paying Rick, but even more happiest is eating some sweet Hooters wings with all the Rick you saved. So, I mean, you're saving or actually winning $2 or $3 more per entry on fantasy draft. And Steve, I know you play a little bit on there. How many wings have you eaten as a result of your tournament savings?
Yeah, so man, it's too hard to keep track. The biggest thing that I'm concerned about is what is going to happen to the Hooter stock once the NFL season is over and you're no longer eating there every weekend. So
yeah, they have nothing else going there besides wings at Hooters. That's the crazy part. Hooters that people don't recognize. It's mostly just football and wings, and that's why we like them. But it's taking a turn. Honestly, if we don't have a Hooters sponsorship for next football season, I'll be sad given how much we've hawked their wings throughout the year. But either way, thank you to Fantasy Draft. Go check them out for yourself. And also one thing you can do for yourself right now, if you're watching this before the 11th of January, use the promo code 2020. It is our last day of our New Year's deal. You get yourself 20 days of Osmo Plus all access. So that is all the sports, all the NFL content for I guess pretty much the rest of the year, as well as the NBA content we have going. So check that out right now at the promo code 2020 at osmo.com/join. All right, Steve, we're glad to have you back. And one question we've been asking to the guests when they come back, because as you mentioned earlier, some picks are right, some picks are wrong. You learn, gain more perspective as the year goes on. Has there been any big takeaway for you this NFL season? Maybe a tip you've learned in terms of making lineups, or just a player you thought stood out? Just anything that jumped out to you that's a lesson learned from this 2019-2020 season?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've really probably took away from this season, well, probably two of them. So first of all is just I think the general public has gotten a lot sharper this year. I think that has a lot to do with some of the content at continuing to get better, projections continuing to get better, ownership projections continuing to get better. But there's a lot of times that players that I think would have gone under the radar in years past has kind of been high owned and actually has, because of them being high owned, has led me to fading them, and that fade didn't work out so well. So I have to rethink about that a little bit. And then the other thing that I think that really stood out to me is the Showdown Slate. So the Showdown Slates really took off, I think, a lot this year. They had big prizes each week, and if you're not playing the Showdown Slates, I think they're one of the biggest edges right now because there's a lot of people that don't know how to play them right, especially when you consider how much sharper that the average player is getting in the normal contest. I think there's not as much content. There's not as much experience with the Showdown Slates that you really should be out there playing those.
I guess we are kind of in Showdown Slate season. So I guess if you had one, 10-second soundbite you'd give people, because I watched that one of the Drewby videos, I think might have been the main one that a lot of people have watched about him breaking down Showdown Slates. Found that really helpful. And so my process as somebody who does short form videos for the Showdown Slates a lot throughout this NFL season. Was there one takeaway? Because the one thing that really stood out to me was him really keying in on high or lower owned receivers at captain and pairing them and make sure the correlations line up. We talk about that a lot of our shows. But I guess, Steve, if you had to give some guy one tip, what would it be for the showdowns for these last few weeks?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll have to check out that video. It's not something that I have seen. I think probably the biggest one that I would say is some of the low-owned, like you said, some of the low-owned wide receivers that are cheap. They hit more often than what their ownership is, and maybe some of the higher-owned ones tend not to hit quite so much. So that's probably a good thing to pay attention to, and making sure that your correlations are in line so that your lineup really can tell a good story.
You'll be talking a lot more about those in the coming weeks, and a lot more feedback from Alex on those too. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So we do have a 4-game though. And this is our last 4-game slate of the week or of the season. So this is the last time we'll have multiple games to really dig into for a full, robust slate. So guys, hit that like button, get that power of positivity in the air, and let's get right into it with our first game here, Minnesota at San Francisco. Last week, Minnesota went into New Orleans, stomped them. Really, that defense came through for the first time all year. A defense that's been graded pretty well by PFF all season long. Hasn't had the results, especially in the outside receiving, giving up a lot of production. That game, they shut down pretty much every aspect of New Orleans that you'd expect it to go off, I guess, besides Taysom Hill. But who can stop that man? Either way, they're getting this matchup here. And Alex, I have to ask up front here, is there a possibility Minnesota does it again? Because, one thing that did jump out to me was really the fact that Minnesota has been a team that a lot of the DVOA-wise, PFF-wise, the grades have been there for their defense. They haven't had the results. Last week, they had the results, and maybe we're due for that. Is there a chance they could do the same thing to San Francisco?
I mean, I will mention that San Francisco's pass defense is much stronger than New Orleans. Of course, Minnesota did it mostly on the ground, but I think that it is a much tougher matchup than it was last week. Of course, there's always a chance, and that's why we play the games. But I'll be looking at Dalvin Cook a lot because he's kind of game script proof. But I'm pretty concerned about the chances of any receiver or quarterback on the Vikings.
Steve, how are you feeling about the Vikings prospects here? Because as Alex mentioned, San Francisco's defense has been really good, particularly outside. They've also gotten a lot healthier with that bye week and a little more time between their last game. So how are you feeling about Minnesota's prospects here offensively going into San Francisco? And also, do you think the defense has a shot to do what it did last week against New Orleans?
Right. So Dalvin Cook, I agree that he's pretty much game script proof. So he'll be one of my top exposures. Really across the slate, I would say. He's in a good spot. The Minnesota, we saw last week that they want to run the ball. We've seen it all year, but especially in the situations that here in the playoffs, they barely really had a lead against the Saints a lot of the game, and they almost threw the game away running it so much. They were just so concerned with running it so heavily. So if they get a chance to run it, Cook will be in a great spot. If they fall behind, he's going to catch a lot of passes. So I think he's in a really good spot. His price is reasonable, and his ownership isn't super high either. I'm not a big fan of Cousins and the passing game nearly as much. Because of that same reason that they're really focused on the run. If they fall behind and fall behind significantly, which the line doesn't necessarily suggest that they're going to fall way behind, then I think there could be some upside for Cousins in comeback mode. But outside of that, I really worry that the ownership for Diggs, for instance, I've got him in the upper 20% range. I think that seems like that's going to be too high for his price and for the where they are at. One thing that we Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
Yep. One thing that we do need to watch out for, I think Thielen is still listed as questionable. With Thielen, a lot of people will assume if he's out, which I don't think he will be, but if he's out, that Diggs will get a big bump. But we really didn't see that this year. What we saw was his snaps were up slightly, but his targets per snap actually decreased from 30% to 24%. It was really Irv Smith that got the big bump. He went up from I think around 15% to 18%, and got a big 25% boost in snaps as well. So at a really low ownership, Irv Smith could potentially be someone that people are overlooking, especially after Rudolph catch the game winner. They might be looking at that recency bias as well.
That makes a lot of sense. And Alex, I guess let's talk real fast about the Minnesota receivers, as we do want to touch on all the important parts here. As Steve mentioned, we also have Diggs projected for mid-20% ownership right now. Price is down for him. He didn't have a good game last week, got mostly shut down while Thielen had the good game. So which guy would you prefer this week, Alex, with Thielen being lower owned, but I guess a little bit banged up, and Diggs going to be a bit cheaper, but much higher ownership, and I guess potential higher risk of busting?
I mean, this one's really simple for me. Diggs has been the better player over the season, and he's either the same price or cheaper depending on what site you play on. And what I look at especially is the rate they're targeted when they're on the field. On the season, Diggs is at 20.7%, Thielen's at 19.7%. Diggs has been more efficient with his targets on the year, a better catch percent and yards per catch. So this is all leading me to think that Diggs is a superior play to Thielen, and I'm going to pretty much ignore what happened last week.
Okay. No, it seems like an approach here, and certainly some possibility here that Diggs is more needed. San Francisco does build up that lead with the run game, as they have many times this year. So let's talk about that run game on San Francisco's side. Minnesota's defense on the year it looks pretty much pedestrian against the run. I guess, the not bad grades, giving up 110 rushing yards per game. They did really do a good job on Alvin Kamara last week, who you would think would be elusive enough to get something going. He did not. But here in San Francisco, we have a three-headed backfield. Raheem Mostert, touchdowns, I believe, in the last 6 games. I don't have that in front of me, but been really scoring at a high clip, but still has Tevin Coleman there and Matt Breida taking away touches. So, Steve, I'll ask you here, the run game for San Francisco, which guy do you like the most? Or is there anybody at all that you like? Maybe you want to skip over this logjam entirely.
No, I think that it's definitely worthwhile to get some shares on the San Francisco side. Mostert looks like his ownership is in the mid-20s also, with Coleman down at the 10% range. So I kind of agree with those ranges. I think I'll have more Mostert. He's been certainly very much more involved in the running game and scoring here lately, but I do think you need a piece of Coleman as well, because it's pretty likely that San Francisco builds up a lead and one of those get in the end zone. So I'll probably end up under the field on Mostert and over the field on Coleman, but probably still a little bit more ownership towards Mostert.
Alex, do you agree with that take there, or you want to come in a bit under Mostert, or do you think that maybe he's just the only guy to trust? How are you leaning with this backfield?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Steve that you may be over on Coleman and under on Mostert, because just the price difference is so substantial. Coleman, depending on what site you play on, is pretty much as cheap as a running back's going to get on this week. So he'd be a name that stands out as maybe like the safe value play of the week. So I think that he's worth taking some shots on for that reason. I'm not really enthusiastic about any of the 3 running backs for San Francisco, though, because they do spread the ball around so much that it makes it pretty tough to pick the right one from week to week.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess the pass game here, if Minnesota, even though they have graded out well, they've given up a good amount of production this year to wide receivers and to stacks and to quarterbacks and to the entire pass game overall. Jimmy Garoppolo does turn the ball over a decent amount. I think he has the highest interception rate on this slate, but he still has had big results on the air. And we have 2 guys who are going to be pretty decently owned in Deebo Samuel and George Kittle. Kittle's ownership has come down a bit from our first run of ownership earlier in the week. We have him at about a third the field on him on DraftKings. So, Alex, how do you feel about this pass game here? It seems like with ownership going to Samuel and Kittle, that Garoppolo looks a bit under-owned, but do you trust the pass game here? Or who do you want, I guess, and how much of a priority are they?
I'm really keying in on Kittle because for the season, the disappointing factor with Kittle was that he was never on the field enough. When he was on the field, he was exceptional in pretty much every category. And we saw it in the last game of the season where it was playing for the bye. Kittle played 47 of 50 snaps. And that gives me a lot of confidence that you'll see better playoff results for him than you did during the regular season. So I think he's someone I'm really optimistic about this week.
Steve, do you agree with that Kittel take, or maybe like Debo or Emmanuel Sanders at much less ownership?
Yeah, so Kittle, I think, is a good play. Probably have him somewhere around the field, so probably around one third of the field. I don't think I'll go way overboard on him. I'll talk about a couple other tight ends that I like as well throughout the show, but I agree exactly with what Alex is saying there about Kittle. For Sanders and Debo, I think I lean towards Emmanuel Sanders here slightly. I could be overrating a couple of his blow up spots throughout the year, but I think it was a couple of weeks throughout the year. I think he had two of them. I don't recall which ones they are. And he really had really nice games in the mid 20 point range on DraftKings. Since then, he's been pretty cold. So I think that's kind of keeping his ownership down. But I think, he's proven that he can kind of blow up there. And so, but maybe I'm overrating that. I don't know. But I'll be over the field on Emmanuel Sanders and probably under on Debo Samuel, who's had a pretty consistent run here lately of mid-teens kind of performances, but nothing really outstanding since for quite a few weeks now. So that's kind of where I'm leaning a little bit over on the field on Sanders, and that overall, because of having those three guys, Sanders, Samuel, and Kittle, that kind of puts me interested in Garoppolo. So in a slate this small, I think you really want to have some correlation between your lineup and maybe go with a couple guys from the same team. And I don't worry so much about the other team. So because I didn't like Diggs and Thielen, and I don't think that's necessarily precluding me from Garoppolo as much as it would maybe on a full slate. So I think that's a little bit different here on a smaller slate.
Alex, do you have a lean between Debo and Emmanuel Sanders? And I guess relative to the field, what would be your interest in that stack with Garoppolo?
So it is nice that the wide receiver core for San Francisco has pretty much stabilized. So we know Debo Samuel and Emmanuel Sanders are really the only guys to target here. Maybe if you're feeling really fancy, go with Kendrick Bourne. Samuel has been... I'm just pulling up the numbers here real quick. So Samuel is targeted a little bit more than Sanders when he's on the field, but that doesn't give me a real strong lean one way or the other here.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess to close the loop on this game entirely, the defenses, Alex, do you see yourself having any of the Niners defense, or I guess prioritizing any Niners defense or Vikings defense in this game?
Well, I think the Niners defense is in a decent spot. Just because Minnesota is projected to do pretty poorly, and they're probably the most talented defense on the slate. Minnesota, I'm kind of optimistic as a contrarian play because Jimmy Garoppolo does throw interceptions at a pretty decent clip. So he's below average on the slate in that regard compared to other quarterbacks.
Steve, how about you? Any lean with these defenses or interest? I guess just, in terms of getting them and going out of your way to get them rather than just getting them as part of an optimization.
Yeah, I'd probably lean towards Minnesota as well. I think that their ownership is quite low for this, slate this size and under 10%. And I know that's a lot driven to being a favorite, but certainly anything could happen, and I'll probably lean that way.
Makes sense. All right, let's keep going here. Tennessee going into Baltimore for a game where Baltimore is currently a 10-point favorite at home. Tennessee, we saw last week, another big stunner from the wild card round, going to New England, beating the Patriots at Gillette, maybe knocking Tom Brady off the roster forever. Baltimore had that bye week. They should be going into a pretty decent spot here against Tennessee defense that's good versus the run, really not good versus the pass, despite what they showed last week. So, Alex, let's talk Tennessee's side first. Derrick Henry here, people not going to be owning him once again, it looks like, even though that's really the one pathway that Tennessee has to win this game, one would think. Derrick Henry, is he a guy you would go to at all, or is just the fact that he's still not a great PPR play balancing it out, as well as a low spread here, or the low total here for Tennessee?
I actually ended up with more Henry than I thought last week at 10%, just because I didn't. He's a guy that just looking at projection is going to undervalue him to some extent. because there is a pretty strong correlation with him and how the game script goes. So if Baltimore really struggles, you're gonna see Henry get a big boost, and that's gonna be significant because some of these Baltimore players are gonna be pretty targeted. So I think if I was gonna play Henry, it'd be in a lineup without much Baltimore. But once again, it's just kind of like there are many other great options at running back, and Henry probably stands out as one of the weakest. Baltimore's defense isn't great. A little bit above average versus the pass. In contrast, New England's defense is very good versus the pass, so that might have skewed it even more towards Henry last week, where this week I think they might plan to throw the ball a little bit more versus a weaker defense.
Steve, do you have a lean here with Derrick Henry? Do you think that he's in play again, or is Baltimore does also blitz at a really high rate, 55% blitz rate for them on the year. So maybe that gives more guys there, gives them more ways to load the box and just make it uncomfortable for Henry. So how are you feeling about Henry's prospects overall?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that you were mentioning that he's low owned in your ownership projections. I have him fairly high owned in mine. I just think that the public watched that Patriots Titans game last week and saw him go nuts, and he's really been going nuts for several weeks in a row. So while I think his price is high and maybe he's not super popular on the sharp side, I do think his ownership will get up there in a contest like the Millie Maker, for instance. If it's going to be low owned, I definitely want some shots for all the reasons that Alex mentioned. He definitely could just blow up in a game where he ends up with the chance to control the game in the game script. But I just don't know that I believe that that's going to happen. So I'll be under what I think the field should be, and probably be pretty low on for me.
So I guess one tournament thought for me would be that because Steve, based on what you're saying, is that if you think the casual player is going to be more inclined to go to Henry, and then let's say Henry does succeed, is there any, I guess to both you guys really, from a game theory perspective, is there some opportunity maybe to go with more Henry then because you're competing against less sharp players, whereas perhaps the sharper players won't have Henry popping as much in optimizations and they know he's not a great PPR back? Alex, do you think there's any sort of logic to going maybe more Henry if the ownership is going to be higher on Henry, even though that does seem kind of counterintuitive?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Where if you feel like all the casual players are going to be on Henry and none of the sharps are, then maybe you can figure out rosters with Henry that really exploit that and pick some guys that the casual players won't be on, and that could be a winning tournament formula.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's, some on the contrary, getting contrarian there. Speaking of contrarian, the pass game here should also be contrarian. And Alex, you mentioned that you had some interest perhaps in Tennessee trying to pass more this week. Do you think AJ Brown's in play? Is Ryan Tannehill back in play after that? I wouldn't say disaster game, but he certainly didn't show much in the wild card.
Yeah, I mean, he just didn't have to throw very much. That is something. It's hard to feel real optimistic about Tannehill, but I do like AJ Brown because he's another guy that throughout the season didn't play quite as much as far as snaps per game. And now during the playoffs, especially because of some injuries to Adam Humphries, because of the injury to Adam Humphries, it kind of solidified playing time for Corey Davis and AJ Brown. So I think that AJ Brown is someone that might go overlooked just because the public perception is that the game plan is Henry, and then everyone else is a distant second.
Steve, you have any thoughts here on the pass game? Would you be willing to go to AJ Brown, given that he also bombed last week? The public should be off of him, but now his price is at a more sustainable region, and he's probably seeing some guys outside who do gamble. Marcus Peters in particular, a guy who will gamble on outside routes. And AJ Brown, if you do that against him, he can catch and run one. So do you have any interest here in Brown and Tannehill too, of course, the luminary at QB?
Yeah. Tannehill's had a great year. I think he's really stepped in and proven that he still belongs in the league, and at a minimum, he's a lot better than Mariota was, right? So I don't have a huge interest in Tannehill just because of the Baltimore defense being quite good. That said, they may be farther behind and have to pass to catch up. So I do think that's a reasonable chance to go with Tannehill. If I do go with Tannehill, I do like stacking Ingram with him, actually, because it is likely that they're going to rely on Henry if they fall into the lead. And then if they don't, it might be because of an Ingram touchdown or something like that. You could say Marquise Brown or somebody like that, but I think Ingram even more so. He has the more touchdown equity. So I think that's an interesting way to kind of pair those two guys together. But even if I'm not playing Tannehill, I do like going with AJ Brown. He's just been on a really good run. He's, I think he has a good claim for Rookie of the Year this year. And I don't know if he'll end up getting that or not, but he should be right there with everybody. So I'll probably be over the field on him. And I also like Corey Davis again. So I've thrown away enough money on Corey Davis this year that I might as well try to continue it. He was in my roster in the DK final, kind of bombed there, kind of bombed every other week this year. But darn it, I'm going to, at 3,700, he's bound to have a good week, and I'm going to take one more shot with it. So, we'll go with him again.
The sunken cost fallacy for the win. Always the move. Let's talk about the Baltimore side, because Steve mentioned Mark Ingram there. He's looking like he's going to be playing. Had some limited practices with the calf, but everything's saying, I think Adam Schefter most recently reported that he'll be in. Baltimore's side here, though, begins and ends with Lamar. So, Alex, I'll ask you here. Lamar going to be, I believe you have him as the highest projected quarterback by a not insignificant margin, but he's priced up. Mark Ingram there, theoretically, they're not going to correlate well. How are you handling the Lamar Jackson and Mark Ingram stuff, Alex? And I guess which of the two would you prefer relative to price and all the other factors you'd consider?
I think that Mark Ingram is the guy that stands out, kind of like Derrick Henry, where he doesn't get a lot of passes, so he may look a little bit undervalued if you just look at projections. But certainly a guy that can break a slate with touchdowns. So I like what Steve's saying. I'm pretty optimistic about Lamar Jackson this week, of course. Especially like the fact that maybe we get some shorter rotations and more Mark Andrews and Marquise Brown, which would put them into stack with Lamar. So I think that Baltimore is probably one of the best stacks of the week for sure.
Steve, you mentioned your Ingram interests, and I guess, can you talk about that a little bit more? And then also relative to the passing game stack, like, do you prefer Ingram, or are you willing to go with Lamar full stacks? Because Lamar full stacks really not a move people have been taking too much this year. The rushing equity he brings can make it a bit of a different equation than a guy like Tannehill or Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah. So Mark Ingram, I don't think I'm a huge fan of Mark Ingram this week, just similar reasons as the Derrick Henry. I think he tends to be overowned by the public, or maybe, as Alex is mentioning, maybe it's just some of the sharper players and me, not necessarily including myself with those, but undervaluing the fact that he could be so game script and flip the slate so heavily. So, but I'm probably underweight on him. I think that Alex makes a really good point on Marquise Brown and Mark Andrews. I'm really going to be curious to see what their snap trends look like this week, and that'll really shape what I'm thinking next week as well. But I am projecting them to play a little bit more than what they have throughout the year. They've been, so I think Marquise Brown has been in the 58% snap range, something like that. Mark Andrews kind of been around 40%. I'm giving them both about an extra 10 to 15% of snaps this week, just because I think the team's going to push to have them in there. I know Mark Andrews is still questionable. I don't know about Marquise Brown, but I know Andrews is. But I think he'll play, and I think that they're going to push him a bit more. So I do like, just because of those additional snaps that they might get this week, I think I like both of those pretty well, and especially Mark Andrews being a pivot off of Kittel and Kelsey. And actually, I don't even hate going with the two tight ends this week. So I think there's a lot of good tight ends at the lower end price points that can help you get guys like Dalvin Cook that we talked about earlier. So yeah, I'm on those guys.
Yeah, Mark Andrews to me is, I agree with that. I think he's an interesting pivot to both Kittel and Kelsey, or addition too. He also gets the same amount of deep looks per game as Marquise Brown did, 1.2 deep targets per game for both those guys, which is a lot for a tight end. So I agree with that take. I guess the ownership run that we had most recently pushed Brown down under 20%. And Alex, I just want to ask you about this because to me, with Brown's price, I feel like he's going to get landed on a bit more than that because I was just building some lineups and running some optimizations and just like hand building. Usually do that as part of my prep process just to do what people will be doing out there when they're doing their own lineup builds. And Brown to me is just a guy like at a weird price point where I don't see anybody else around him you want to have. And I feel like you land on that 45, 46, 4,400 range a lot on DraftKings in particular. Do you think Brown's ownership is going to stay under 20? Like, is he actually going to be borderline contrarian for this 4-game slate, or do we think that moves?
Yeah, I mean, I would check our latest ownership for the lock. It's going to be the most accurate, but we work all week trying to hone in on those things. I think that Marquise Brown, I think that sharps aren't going to be super high on him just because, first of all, Baltimore runs the ball like so much that it's hard to project Jackson to have very many pass attempts in this game. And then Mark Andrews is going to get a lot of the work. So you're getting a wide receiver 2 basically on a team that doesn't pass the ball a lot, which isn't ideal. And that's the other thing, though, like Chris, what you're mentioning is the alternatives are like Kenny Stills and Alan Lazard, Corey Davis, right. Like guys that
Corey Davis.
So we know which way Steve's going out of that.
Yeah, I mean they're huge question marks on all these guys. So Marquise Brown certainly fits the salary cap pretty well.
Yes, Brown's an interesting player. Certainly one who can probably be a decider on the slate. Let's talk about these defenses too, because I just want to make sure we cover everything as best we can. Steve, Baltimore or Tennessee defense, either jumping out to you as a possibly viable play. Tennessee was the defense to play last week, thanks to that touchdown that Tom Brady was so generous to give them at the end of the game.
I think both are kind of priced right on both ownership and cost, so I don't see really a big benefit on either one. I'll probably be right around the field on both of those. And just kind of to loop around on your Marquise Brown take, I had him at 28% on my ownerships, so I'm kind of with you that I see him as a bit higher owned right now.
Yeah, something to watch for sure. And again, as Alex mentioned, check the ownership projections as we get closer to lock tomorrow, because that's going to definitely move one way. Alex, the defense is Tennessee or Baltimore. Any of these guys jumping out to you as being particularly worthwhile or one that you'd want above the field?
I think there is an argument for Tennessee because Lamar does throw a decent amount of interceptions on a per play basis. But they are my lowest projected defense of the week. I'll throw that in there. I think there is a reasonable chance they could hit. And then Baltimore, probably one of the higher projected defenses. But I don't really feel strongly given that they're one of the highest priced too.
Okay, that seems fair. Let's keep going here. Houston heading into Kansas City, the game that seems on paper most likely to be a shootout, highest combined total out of these games. A little bit over 50 implied points or combined points between the two teams. Kansas City, though, a 10-point favorite at home, 30.5 implied points to them. Houston, did a good job against Buffalo. I think Deshaun Watson was a guy in our strategy syllabus thing that we do for premium members, Vosmo.com. I had Deshaun Watson as one of my fades last week just because I didn't think that he was going to get there against Buffalo. He did. He won that game, got production, even though his guys really didn't produce that well for him. So this week, Alex, Houston as the stack, I guess, are they appealing to you? And I guess we'll do the tough question right away. Would you prefer a Watson stack or a Mahomes stack out of this game?
Yeah, just correction real quick. I said that about Jackson. I hadn't updated back from when RG3 was the quarterback, so he actually doesn't throw many picks, so my bad. Okay, Houston is probably my contrarian stack of the week because I think their team total really sells the chance that the passing offense works a little bit short. Kansas City's defense is a little bit above average versus the pass and below average versus the run. But Houston, I do project to throw at one of the highest clips of any team this week. And we can see by this 20 team total, like that their overall prospects aren't that good, but there's going to be a lot of variance in the outcome given how much Watson's going to throw it.
Steve, do you agree? Would you prefer a shot at that Houston stack, or are you willing to go to the extremely, extremely chalky? You know how our guy Brick last week would answer this. He would not want to go to that Kansas City chalk, but they do look like a great stack. So who do you prefer, a Watson stack or a Mahomes stack?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on how you think about it. I probably have both Mahomes and Watson pretty similar for what I'll own them. The ownership is going to say Mahomes is quite a bit higher owned than Watson. So I guess relative to the field, I'll probably be overweight on Watson, underweight on Mahomes. But overall, probably a pretty similar ownership. I do think that Watson has that good upside. A 10-point underdog is something that is always good for the passing game. Also, 10-point favorite is good for the passing game. A lot of people think 10-point favorite is rough because they might run out the game with the running back. But a lot of times what you find is being such a favorite, the quarterback means that their team is a lot better than the other team's defense. So they have their way and kind of build up the lead. And that tends to be pretty beneficial as well. So I like both of them, but probably Mahomes under the field.
So one thing which I have to talk about here, because this is the only playoff game I believe we have this week where the teams played during the year, but Houston did steal that win against Kansas City during their stretch earlier this year where they were kind of finding themselves. They had some guys out of the lineup as well, but Carlos Hyde drove the action in that game for Houston. His biggest fantasy game of the year, had over 100 rushing yards and a score. Is Carlos Hyde in play for you, Alex? Because he's not going to be owned again. And I pitched him last week, and he had the kind of Carlos Hyde results with like 80 yards and a touchdown, which was fine. Probably not going to win you a tournament. Would you go to Carlos Hyde this week knowing that there is a chance, or at least we have evidence that Houston maybe can do this against Kansas City?
So I think the game script certainly is not like set up very well for Carlos Hyde since they are such a big underdog. The matchup itself is fine, but what it's going to come down to me, based on that, is the price. And Carlos Hyde just isn't even really a value price this week. There's many more better options per dollar, so I don't see much reason to go to Carlos Hyde.
Steve, any Carlos Hyde for you?
No, I don't think too much, other than maybe a random sprinkling here or there. Kind of a lot of the same reasons, I would say. I probably have a little bit slightly more interest in Duke Johnson as an interesting actual pairing with Mahomes. If Mahomes does well and the game shoots out and Houston's trying to come back, there's a good chance that they'll be involving Duke Johnson in the passing game quite a bit, which we've seen here recently. So probably be a little bit more on Duke Johnson than Hyde.
And I guess let's comb through the Houston pass catchers here. DeAndre Hopkins had a decent day last week, but certainly not one worth the ownership that he had on him going against Tre'Davious White. Was mostly impressed enough there, but still had okay results, just didn't get into the end zone. This week, going against Kansas City, according to DVOA, has been a really strong team against wide receiver ones. Hopkins is a different kind of weapon here, but Alex, I'll ask you first the targets here. And Will Fuller, worth noting, he's currently a game time decision as he was last week. Seems to be trending towards playing, but at least this week he's priced very close to Kenny Stills, so you can make that swap. But Alex, how are you feeling about the pass catchers for Houston? Is Hopkins a must-have, or are you willing to stack without him? Where are you doing with the pass game overall?
Yeah, I think last week it was interesting because the Millionaire Maker winning lineup had Stills and Fells and no Hopkins or Carter, I guess. So my general strategy is I always like to get the wide receiver one in my stack just because, I mean, that's the most obvious guy to correlate. This Will Fuller situation is an interesting wrinkle, but I think there's a third possibility here, which is that he plays, but he just doesn't play as much as you would hope. Just not a full workload. And because NFL is do or die, that is something we see a lot of the time as they will rush some guys back from injury. Zach Ertz was a notable example last week. So I'm not really high on getting Fuller here. Stills is a decent option, but his price is actually pretty high depending on the site. So I'm just kind of finding that I like Hopkins, and it's pretty hard to justify anyone else.
So Alex, really quick, what percent of snaps do you think Fuller will play?
Yeah, that's something that I mean I can just guess, but so if I have him in for about 2/3 of the snaps right now, and that gets his projection kind of in the territory where you could take a shot. But that is a situation where a median projection isn't really an optimal way of doing it, because you either want to assume, one of these two situations and not try to average them out both at the same time.
Steve, do you have any thoughts about that? Because, there's certainly some logic there. And I guess if you were to view it through that lens as well, that could open Fuller as more of a decoy to give Stills production. That's been one popular meme for people this year, that Kenny Stills is somehow better in games with Will Fuller in there. So do you have any thoughts on the situation overall?
Yeah, so I think this is the most important decision of the slate, actually. So I have Fuller at 75% of the snaps. Throughout the year, he's normally in the 95, 90-ish range if he's fully healthy. So 75% is actually is a pretty big bump down. And absolutely he has a big wide range of those snaps. So most people, you don't have the snaps risk with them. For instance, DeAndre Hopkins is probably going to play 98% of the snaps. You just have to worry about what his variation in his targets and TDs and those type of things are going to be. Whereas Fuller not only has that type of variation, he has variation in his snaps that could be all the way up to 90%, or they could be all the way down to 25%. Really, I mean, he could be out there just on big plays. So I think that is a huge thing. Or he could just not even play, like you said, and that's the day two. So if you plug him in your lineups and he doesn't even play, you're left, swapping to Fuller or Jacob Hollister or someone in that. I guess Sammy Watkins looks like is kind of a similar price range, but none of those guys are going to be as good of plays as Fuller. So there's a lot of risk there, but one thing we've seen is that Fuller can, when he is healthy, and if he gets in there for a play or two, he could just blow up the slate. And I think especially if the public is going to be scared off of him for those reasons, I have him in the low teens, it looks like, in ownership. I really like taking some shots on him just for his upside.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And certainly if Kansas City's pass defense is improved, as we talked about, you would think they're going to sell out to try to limit what Hopkins can do. And that's going to open up opportunity for somebody else there. And I guess we should also talk real fast about Darren Fells and Jordan Akins, because I think that's something people may be curious about. As Alex mentioned, Fells is in a tournament winning lineup. A very non-controversial tournament winning lineup. and that was because Jordan Akins wasn't in the mix this week. He's been limited in practice. I think the expectations will be back in there. But Alex, Fells and Akins, I assume Fells would be a guy you would want to go to if Akins is back in.
Yeah, especially because he's no longer the minimum price. So it really, there's so many good tight ends on this slate. I can't see myself ending up on Fells if he's going to be seeing a decrease in playing time.
Steve, you agree?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, yeah. I want to make sure we're covering all the bases, and that's one. People will see all the $1 million winnings that have been out there with Darren Fells. Let's talk about Kansas City's side. We talked about they are chalky as hell in every single spot here. Even Sammy Watkins projecting for over 20% ownership. Travis Kelce, one of the chalk tight ends of the week. Tyreek Hill actually might be the chalk tight end of the week. Tyreek Hill also having decent ownership. And Damian Williams, the chalk player overall on DraftKings, according to our most recent run of ownership. Patrick Mahomes, also the chalk QB of the week. But it all makes sense because Houston's pass defense has been terrible. The run defense actually a little bit better with J.J. Watt in the mix. But Alex, how are you handling this? I guess, are you willing to go to Mahomes stack with Damian Williams and plus another pass catcher, maybe two? Are you just going Williams as a pivot away from the stacks? How are you handling Kansas City overall, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a negative you have Damian Williams in the same lineup as Mahomes. But because Damian Williams is such a good play, I'm sure I'll have lineups that have that combination. Just because when Damian Williams gets those rushing yards, which I have making up about a little bit more than half of his production, obviously you don't get that correlation, which is kind of a disappointing thing. So I think that you got Tyreek Hill, you got Kelsey. Obviously, those are great options to stack up, and I have Mahomes as being the most likely to be the top scoring quarterback stack this week, despite the fact that they are such big favorites. Just because the matchup's good, the fact that they could easily put up a huge score in 3 quarters before running the clock out comes into play. So I think I'm definitely going to be having a lot of Chiefs this week.
Steve, is there anything you're willing to do here to get weird to differentiate a very high owned Chiefs roster? Every player on the Chiefs is going to be owned this week. So how are you doing approaching this to get weird and maybe still capture that production from the Chiefs?
Yeah, so just kind of looking at my ownerships for in my last crunch that I ran, it looks like pretty much across the board I'm slightly underweight on the Chiefs, but not significantly. So I think that they're really pretty solid plays, but just kind of owned a little bit too high. I think the other big question of the slate, so I mentioned Fuller as one. I think the other big question is Lesean McCoy. So Damian Williams being the chalk, everyone assumes, yeah, he's been tearing it up here lately. Had a really big game week 17, and we've seen Lesean McCoy kind of inactive, what they keep calling managing his workload. So I think the question now is, have they been managing his workload all year so that he can be fresh come playoff time? And this is where we see him really start cutting into Damian Williams' work and get McCoy into the workload more, or where they manage his workload just because he's old and he can't really play as many games in a row, and he just kind of goes back to that 20 to 25% of the snap ranges. I kind of think it's a little bit more of the latter, where they might rely on him and his kind of experience a little bit more in the playoffs, and which would be a hit to Damian Williams. I don't think the public is taking it into consideration enough.
Yeah, I'm actually curious about your thoughts about that too, Alex, because Steve, I was thinking that too. And we have LeSean McCoy right now projected for 0, it looks like. Is there any concern at all about that? Is McCoy a possible pivot to a chalky Damian Williams? Like, is it worth having any exposure to McCoy this week, Alex? Or do you think he's just the guy, like, it's just going to go to Williams and that's just what it is?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because obviously LeSean McCoy, I'm trying to scroll back through these game logs in Kansas City. He played 17 snaps in week 15, didn't play week 16, 17, 24 snaps week 14. When he's been, yeah, I mean, I just assumed it's because he's not that good a player. But there could be something else going on here, which it wouldn't really lead me to play LeSean McCoy necessarily, but that would be a knack against Damian Williams.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible that Williams maintains, as Steve mentioned, a large portion of 75% share of that workload, but maybe that makes Williams less of a lock play like he's currently being treated industry-wide, so that's something to consider. Let's close the loop here with the defenses. Kansas City defense, Houston's defense. Steve, either of these appealing to you?
I like the Houston defense, not the Kansas City so much. Kansas City's okay, probably somewhere around the field on them, but Houston in particular, I think, is pretty interesting. Kind of like you were talking before on the price points of whoever that was you mentioned, I can't recall, but Texans are at 2,000 for their price point on DraftKings, while the field average is at about 2,900. So you can build a really different lineup if you go to the Texans defense. I know a lot of people think, oh yeah, well, the Kansas City offense is going to be scoring the most points, but really all you need is a fluky pick six or sack that gets returned for a touchdown, something like that happens, and all of a sudden you have a low-owned, low-cost team that also has a lot different ownership across the slate that could really break the slate for you and really give you a big edge on the rest of the field.
Alex, do you agree that maybe that puts the Texans defense in play, or is the Chiefs defense maybe at home more appealing because that's one way that they can score without the offense getting it?
Yeah, I mean, I like that the Texans is just incredibly cheap, so that you kind of gain leverage on the field that has Kansas City. But from an overall projection, I mean, they're going to get completely crushed most weeks. Like, I don't think they project very well at all. Mahomes doesn't throw a ton of picks. Let me pull up the sack rates here. So I have them projected for about 2.5 sacks, which is second, or pretty much everyone's in that range, I guess. But the fluky touchdowns, this is kind of a casual observation, but it seems like they're most likely to happen in like the desperation plays at the end of the game. So it makes sense to play some lineups, assuming that Houston wins the game, and maybe play the defense, and that gives you a lot of leverage over the field that's going to be really heavy on Kansas City.
Yeah, I mean, overall, just on paper, to fully close the loop on Houston's defense, 270 passing yards per game, which is the slate high, giving up the most passing TD, the highest passing TD rate with 5.8%, which is a slate high. Also giving up the worst red zone defense. So there's a lot of things that are not favoring Houston's defense, but that price, that's DFS. So welcome to the game.
There's also a small chance with such a small slate that no defense really does great, and having a $2,000 defense is helpful in that case as well. So that's another opportunity for success.
Yeah, that's definitely a good way to think about it for when you're playing DFS in general, that there's a million different outcomes, and some of them that save you money can be a valuable outcome. Let's talk about the last game here. Seattle heading into Green Bay. Green Bay, a 4.5-point favorite, at least as I pulled the stats before the show. It looks like this ownership will not be on Seattle once again. Alex mentioned in his tweet to promote the show today, DK Metcalf, despite that monster game, despite being a tournament-winning player in a variety of different lineups out there. And we talked about him on the show, to be clear. We don't toot our own horns too much, but I think we were all very much bullish on DK Metcalf. He came through. Now this week, it looks like the field isn't going to be chasing that big game here, but Green Bay's given up some production on the ground and through the air, even though that defense has stiffened up a bit over the last month. Green Bay's offense, going against a Seattle defense that looked good last week, but that was against a skeleton crew, Philadelphia. They have not been good on the year overall, giving up a lot of passing yards, also giving up a lot of scores. Alex, which side do you like more here? Are we willing to go back to Seattle with that stack that we liked so much at low ownership last week?
Man, this is one of the spots where I just feel like really strongly that Green Bay is overrated as a team, just based on all their statistics. Their defense has been below average versus the pass and the run this year. As far as passing, Aaron Rodgers is hovering around 7 yards per attempt, which is pretty underwhelming. So I'm pretty optimistic about Seattle in this game. And I also, this is kind of more of a narrative-based argument, but I feel like with all the running backs out and they're kind of relying on these guys they haven't played most of the season, that kind of gives me an extra bump to Russell Wilson from a narrative standpoint, because they're far more trusting in him, I'm sure. So I kind of like the spot, given that it seems like Seattle isn't that high on this week.
Yeah, they were not last week, and we didn't project them that owned, and they didn't get that ownership we thought might come. Steve, do you agree here? Do you think that it's a good spot for Russell Wilson returning to, people want a little more narrative, returning to Wisconsin, the place that he did play in college?
Yeah, good one. Hadn't thought about that angle, but that could certainly be a good plus for him. Yeah, I don't love Seattle. I think it's a fair point that they might pass a little bit more. That because of Homer and Lynch. But what we've just seen from that coaching staff is they rather run it as much as possible all year long. So I could see both sides of that. I don't have Wilson too much right now, and I don't really have the running game a whole lot. I have Travis Homer a little bit. I think the public is going to be on Marshawn Lynch too much, so I don't think I'll probably end up there too much. So not a lot on the running game there. The one guy on Seattle that I do like, and it's kind of my unfortunate same Corey Davis thing, is I'm going to try to take another shot on Jacob Hollister. So I've been taking quite a few shots on him over the last couple weeks, I guess, ever since he's been their main guy, and he hasn't scored since week 10, but his targets has been there a lot the last several weeks. And I think he's just kind of due for one of those weeks where he gets in the end zone, especially if tight end is getting so many targets. I really like him as an option, especially at low ownership as well, because he hasn't scored for so long. And maybe if they pass a little bit more, especially at the goal line, he's one that finally kind of benefits from it. So I like to go there. I think your question on DK Metcalf and his ownership is good. I don't have him projected super high either. But after how well he did last game, I think that there has to be some group of people that are just going to load up on him and think that he's going to have the big game. So it'll be really interesting to see how his ownership goes and what kind of – I think sometimes throughout the regular season, not everyone is watching every game, but in the playoffs, people are watching most of the games, I would say. So a lot of people really saw him kind of dominant. And I think that's going to carry some short-term, analysis to people.
Steve, do you have a lean between Lockett and Metcalf? Because Metcalf is now on DK, at least priced up a little bit more than Lockett. But we do have Lockett projected for a little bit more ownership. Again, though, this might be skewing towards the sharp side. I think we'll see as we get closer to lock how the ownership kind of adjusts. But would you have a lean between Metcalf and Lockett?
Probably towards Metcalf a little bit, unless their ownerships get a little bit more even, I would say.
Alex, do you agree there? Would you want to go Metcalf's way, or do you think that Lockett and having the longer term sample, and also, you mentioned the Wilson thing, he does have that longer term connection with Wilson as well. Would you rather go his way?
I have them projected really, really close. They both get targeted at a similar rate when they're on the field. Both are on the field almost the whole game. So I think that they're both fine plays. The one thing I will suggest with Seahawks is I know David Moore was the popular play last week, but now they have Dron Brown and Malik Turner most likely back from injury. So I would just avoid all three of those guys personally.
Okay, that seems fair. Let's talk the Green Bay side. Aaron Jones has been getting a lot of the workload, but Jamal Williams has been back in practice, expect to be back into the lineup there. And that's one situation where maybe Aaron Jones gets more of the carries, more of the snaps because it's the playoffs. Maybe Jamal Williams gives them a different look that they like. They have shown that split for most of the year. So Alex, I'll ask you first, Jones, Williams, either of these guys appealing to you? And going against a Seattle defense that's really not been that great versus the run. They also haven't been great versus the pass either, particularly not good versus the run.
Yeah, I mean, Jones is someone that I'd be hesitant to recommend people to avoid because he has shown that when Green Bay really blows up, he could easily win a slate. But that being said, I think I'm going to be super underweight on him just because Williams is coming back. That's a pretty significant threat to his workload. And the fact that I'm just not that bullish on Green Bay to begin with. So I prefer other options this week.
Steve, do you agree that Aaron Jones might be a bit overvalued because of the games? I mean, there is one thing with him where I believe pretty much every time he's gotten 14 or more touches, I forget what podcast I was listening to, but so I might be misquoting their stat completely. But basically, when he gets to work, he plays well. So you willing to go to Jones this week, Steve, or is the ownership plus the potential risk of losing carries to Williams too much?
No. So I might have to rethink about him there because Aaron Jones is my second favorite play, so we'll be on the opposite sides of this one, I guess.
How about we do 300 lineups? You pick Jones at 150. I pick someone else.
Yeah. Steve, you play Aaron Jones in all your lineups. Alex will not play Aaron Jones in all of his, and nobody will ever know.
Got it covered. Great.
I just came up with that idea off the top of my head. I have no idea.
So, so I think I really like Aaron Jones. I think he just has that explosiveness in him. I do think Jamal Williams is a little bit of a risk, but I just think that they're going to rely pretty heavily on Aaron Jones. And I think Aaron Rodgers, I don't think it's a terrible play either. And there is some correlation between them. They're not not nearly as great as the correlation with Devontae Adams, but I don't hate the Aaron Jones, Aaron Rodgers in comeback mode against Seattle. I think that I agree with the take that Green Bay is overrated, and I think that You can kind of tell that by Seattle being, only a 4-point underdog at Green Bay and coming off of a bye as well. So I don't know. I think Aaron Jones is good in a comeback role. They like Jamal Williams more in the leading role. So that's my take.
How are we feeling about Davante Adams, Steve? Because you mentioned him as part of your talk about Aaron Jones, but he's a guy who is really not going to be terribly highly owned, at least based on our most recent run of ownership. And the role has been there for him and the opportunity has been steady for him. He's been really one of the more consistent players on the stretch of the season. Are you willing to go to Adams? Do you feel like he's undervalued or appropriate valued if the field is going to have him at about 25%?
Yeah, I like Adams. I think I like going over the field on him. I think he also makes him and Lazard make a good pairing with Aaron Rodgers. Lazard has kind of bumped up his snaps the last 3 weeks. He's kind of been in the 75% range with Valdez-Scantling taking a bump down doing the teens. So before it had been pretty clear that you want to stack Aaron Rodgers with Davante Adams. And Lazard hasn't really had a big game, so even though his snaps has gone up, people aren't necessarily noticing it too much. But his opportunities could lead him to a chance. And so yeah, I'll take some of the Green Bay that everyone else is off of.
Alex, I know you said you're not big on Green Bay, but that does mean that Green Bay could be playing from behind. So would you go to any Green Bay stacks here, or maybe you just view Davante Adams as being on a separate island from Green Bay, potentially underperforming here?
No, I think Adams is a totally good play this week. Anytime you have a really good wide receiver, there's so much variance in the outcomes, whether they get a touchdown or not, even that they tend to be good GPP plays. And him and Lazard, I think are good plays this week. I agree with what Steve said about Lazard, seeing the bump in playing time. He looks like a nice play based on that. The price is pretty low for him, so he's one of the top value plays of the week, in my opinion. And then I noticed Geronimo Allison really saw a ton of work in week 17 where they were incentivized to win. But man, he's just been he doesn't get targets, and he hasn't really done much with the targets so far this year. So it's hard to land on him, but he's going to be out there. So that could be someone that the stats don't show he could do well, but maybe the opportunity is there.
Okay. I think that seems fair to me. And yeah, Lazard going to be in a mix for a lot of people at that price point. Again, that same price point as Marquise Brown that we talked about earlier. And then to close the loop fully on this game, defenses, either defense jumping out to you, Alex?
So Aaron Rodgers probably throws some of the lowest numbers of picks in the league. So that's a big knock against going to Seattle's D. They're tied with me with Tennessee as being the worst of the week. I would prefer Green Bay, I suppose, but it's hard to be real optimistic about them as well.
Steve, do you share those same views?
Yeah, I'm not really big on either one, and I think pretty much for similar reasons. Wilson also isn't, the big turnover guy, especially because they like running it if possible. So nope, I'll be underweight.
All right. So those are all the games. And now let's close it out with our, what did we do last week? We did top stack or the top contrarian. I don't even remember what we did. It would have been helpful. It would have been helpful if I updated the run sheet to include that, but I still have the stuff from the regular season. We'll do preferred stack and contrarian stack, I guess, and then fade of the week. But guys, hit that like button because these final picks will be only as good as the amount of likes we have. And also shout out to Fantasy Draft, of course, the official home of Rake Free DFS, the sponsor of this show, sponsor of a lot of shows on this channel. Go check them out right now, not just for us, but for yourself with the promo code OSMO. You can get yourself a 7-day trial there to the world of Rake Free DFS, where you are not paying rake, a thing that costs you 10 to 15%. A lot of the other sites you're playing out there. Let's go to fantasydraft.com right now and use the promo code OSMO, or download the Fantasy Draft app in the app store of your choosing. All right, Alex, I'll ask you first here. I guess just give them both in, I don't know. Yeah, give them both. We're behind. Give them both in one round here. Your preferred stack overall, independent of ownership, and then your contrarian stack. Who would it be?
So on my top stacks, I have Kansas City is probably double the average chance of being the best stack, but I'm going to not use them for this because I feel like it's going to be pretty hard to build a unique lineup with Kansas City because every single player is so popular. For that reason, I kind of prefer Houston as my chalk stack. It's because I feel like they still have a great chance because they throw the ball so much, and being the underdogs, you got an obvious option in Hopkins, and then you can kind of mix it up with some Fuller and Stills. My contrarian stack, I don't understand the ownership on Russell Wilson being so low. We have him at 9%. I have them as the third highest projected to be the top stack. And for the reasons I was saying, I think they're going to lean on Wilson a little bit more, even potentially like running the ball a little bit more too. So I think that I'm pretty optimistic about their chances.
Steve, how about for you? Who'd be your top overall stack and your contrarian stack pick?
I think overall, I think I'll say I'll go with the Houston stack, and we'll assume that Will Fuller plays and run some Watson and Fuller stacks together. I think that's a good option. That you could kind of call that contrarian as well, especially if you think of Fuller kind of on the low owned side. For lower owned quarterback, probably Aaron Rodgers would go that route, playing from behind against Seattle. I don't think he's been as great as a lot of people have said this year, but I think playing behind, I think him and Devontae Adams or maybe Lazard as a double stack is a good way to kind of differentiate yourself from the field.
All right, for my top stack, I'm just going to be obvious and go Kansas City. I just feel like that's the one. It feels wrong to pick another one as a top stack. And then for contrarian, yeah, I think I would share the sentiment on Seattle. I think there are some ways here that I think Green Bay's defense is a little better than you guys may think, but I still believe that Russell's too low owned. I don't know what the deal is. I know he hasn't had the greatest outlier results down the stretch of the regular season, but we know what he can do. We know what he's capable of when they have to pass. So I would still err on that side. And then fade of the week, any player on the slate, Steve, who would it be?
So I think it'll really come down to his ownership, I guess. So if we're going by my ownership, I'll say Derrick Henry. He's not very high owned on yours, but so I'll give you 2. But Derrick Henry, I'll probably be under the field on. I think he'll be higher owned than what you guys are saying right now. And since he's not super high owned, I would say my other one is probably Diggs. I really don't think that I don't love that Minnesota passing attack at all, and his ownership in the mid 20% range doesn't really make sense to me.
Alex, who would be your fade of the week?
I guess it would be Aaron Jones. I suppose I don't feel great about that, but I got to pick someone high owned. Well, actually, hold on. We have Deebo Samuel projected for 31% ownership.
We do.
Man, like that doesn't make any sense to me. So I'll pick him. I think that he's tied for a second behind Kittel, obviously, with Emmanuel Sanders. I'm having to pull up his game log because I don't understand why he's so high on him, but I guess he had a big game in week 17. Pretty good game log. So if we factor in the whole season, I'm having trouble landing on him.
All right, I'll get ballsy with mine. George Kittle would be my fade here. Just so it jumped out to me, Minnesota's tight end defense, according to DVOA, has been really good. A 48% decrease in production on the year. And I do think with the pressure Minnesota gets, you could see Kittle kept in the block a lot more, which he is good at. I'm still going to get that production there, but I think with a third of the field on him, we had him at almost half the field earlier in the week. We'll see what the final number shakes out at. If he's between 30 and 50%, I would just like to have less. You can't full fade George Kittle, but I'd like to have less than him. So he would be my pick. All right, Steve, we appreciate you doing the show for a second time. So as always, we want to open the floor for you to plug whatever you want, whether it's your Twitter at Steve Buzzard, your work at Football Guys, anything in the world. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. Appreciate the chance to come back and visit with you guys. You could definitely check out all my work over at footballguys.com. Do a lot of good content there. I do the ownership projections, what I think are some of the best in the industry. And then also do a weekly article. Don't do that here during the playoffs, but we still continue to have a lot of really good content. We've had been around the fantasy football realm for as long as any sites out there. So well before DFS and continue to put out some of the best projections for, again, my ownership projections as well as points projections as well. So I think and our price point is really competitive as well. So I really think you should check that out. And then other than that, you can just be on Twitter every now and then as well. So feel free to follow there and ask me any questions that you might have along the way this week. And also encourage everyone to play some of the Showdown slates. So get out there and play those. There's a lot of good prizes out there. Don't forget about those and give them a shot.
You go follow at Steve Buzzard right now, a very smart guy about DFS and the entire fantasy industry and just football analysis in general. And Alex, go anything you want to hit on before we call it quits here for this divisional round?
Yeah, Steve, thanks for being on the show. You're definitely giving everyone a lot of food for thought. So I'm going to have to sleep on all these points you made here. I might have to land on some Will Fuller tomorrow more than I expected now that I'm thinking about it. So thanks, Fantasy Draft, of course, for sponsoring the show every week. And thanks, of course, you, the audience, for being so supportive of all the work that we do on YouTube.
I didn't see if you pointed at the screen on that one because my video feed is not. But I hope you did. I hope you said you. You do the Uncle Sam. Oh, Uncle Sam. And we want you at Awesemo.com right now to use the promo code 2020. Our last day here. Use it right now. If you use that promo code 20 days for just $20 of Awesemo Plus, premium all access, every sport, all the data that brilliant mind of Alex's comes up with. It's all at your fingertips right now at Awesemo.com/join. Check out our content. Also, weekend long, we have live before lock shows coming up Saturday. Sunday is actually me and Lofty going back and doing a Sunday only live before lock. So watch that one because we'll have some fun short slate / showdown takes. We appreciate you guys. Hope you have a great divisional round. Enjoy this last 4-pack of NFL games. This is it, guys. We are in lean times. So we appreciate you. Have a good weekend and good luck.